In this video, we'll talk about the concepts behind ovulation in bit more details. So, ovulation happens at day 14 in an ovarian cycle. So, overall, the ovarian cycle has two broad phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. In follicular phase, the follicles which are present in the ovary grows and eventually they rupture at day 14 and finally corpus luteum forms. So our focus is around day 14 and just a little bit before that to understand what really happens during the time of ovulation. So ovulation is triggered by a spike in LH level or luteinizing hormone level just before the ovulation. So this triggers the rupture of a Graafian or mature follicle and releasing of the oocyte that would be eventually be used for fertilization. So before understanding and moving forward, we have to understand the cell division kinetics just before the process of ovulation. So this is the ovulation process right now, and we are going to look at the 0H hour where LH surge happen. And between these two important landmark events, there are many cellular changes that are occurring. So at 0th hour, there is germinal vesicle and nucleolus clearly visible. Eventually, the germinal vesicle, that the overall nuclear lamina, actually breaks down inside the oocyte. So this is happening 15 hours after the LH surge. First mitotic metaphase occurs at around 20 hours. And just before ovulation, that means 35 hours after this LH surge, second meiotic metaphase is complete. And after that, ovulation would take place. Now, lot of changes happen in the mature follicle altogether during the process of ovulation. So here you can see the cumulus oophorus cells, which kind of work like a stalk holding the entire oocyte surrounded by the granulosa cells. So obviously here you can see right now at the 0th hour of LH surge that there is the germinal vesicle and the nucleolus is pretty distinct and the nuclear membrane is intact. Now you can see at around 15 hours the germinal vesicle breaks, and also the oocytes surrounded by these cells are now released into the follicular antrum. Why is so? Because the germinal vesicle breaks down and the cumulus cells surrounding the oocyte lose their cell-to-cell contact. So they are no more adhered very nicely. That is why the stalk is broken and it is now released into the follicular antrum. So cumulus oophorus expands in response to the LH surge. Now what would happen? That eventually there would be some triggers that would rupture the follicle. These triggers are tension, which is produced by the smooth muscle cells in the follicular wall, and also the collagen degrading enzyme would act upon to release the basically the oocyte into the fallopian tube. Also, it has been seen that there are certain role of histamine and prostaglandin during the period of ovulation. Now let's talk about the ovarian cycle a little bit in a little bit details to understand the oocyte development. So basically, ovary is the primary reproductive organ in females, and ovarian cycle suggests the events of maturation of the egg and basically release of the egg. Now the ovulation cycle is kind of regulated by specific hormones secreted by hypothalamus, pituitary and the gonads. So basically the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis is controlling the process of ovulation and the follicle maturation, which we would learn. So right now we are looking at a hypothetical snapshot into a ovary, where we can see there are primordial follicles, primary follicles, secondary, tertiary, mature Graafian follicles, and also the ovulation is happening. So all these events doesn't happen all together. It's kind of like a hypothetical timeline where we are able to show all these things. Anyway, this is the corpus luteum, which is the residual form of the Graafian follicle after ovulation. This is important for hormonal regulation. Now at least we can understand there are few follicles which we have to dig deep into: the primordial follicle, primary, secondary and Graafian follicle. So the primordial follicle is the most primitive form of ovarian follicle. They are present in the ovary before even the time of birth. So they consist of an immature oocyte or egg surrounded by the single layer of flattened granulosa cells. So these are also follicular granulosa cells. Now, before even a woman is born, or basically when the gestational week 10 is almost there in the mother's womb, then these primordial follicles are developing. So about 200,000 are produced during the birth, but by puberty only 40,000 survives. And out of these 40,000, 400 to 450 would eventually mature to give rise to a Graafian follicle and eventually lead to ovulation. So primordial follicle eventually becomes primary follicle. Now, basically, there are specific cell division events that are happening. Now, there would be also secondary follicle. Secondary follicle is about 100 micron thickness. Secondary follicle has a thicker granulosa cells. Here you can see the basement lamina is also formed at this point of time. Granulosa cell become more cuboidal. The oocyte is now fully grown and zona pellucida develops. So between primordial and the primary follicle, what really changes is the morphology of the granulosa cells. So in the primordial follicle, they are kind of like squamous and flattened, and in case of primary follicle, they are cuboidal in shape. Anyway, the secondary follicle is about 200 micron in thickness, and in secondary follicle, the key feature that starts appearing is multi-layer granulosa cells, and eventually some of the follicular cells now dissociate from each other and forms antrum or a cavity, fluid-filled cavity. Here are the granulosa cells, here are the fully grown oocyte, here you can see the zona pellucida, here are the theca cells. Theca cells are hormone producing cell. In a moment it would be important why how they are regulating the ovulation process. And this is a tertiary follicle where you can see several different fluid filled cavities has formed, marked in blue, and eventually the tertiary follicle would develop to give rise to a Graafian or mature follicle which has a huge fluid filled cavity. And in that case you can see the theca interna and theca externa. I mean, the theca become more specialized to two different layers. Also, this antrum is huge. Corona radiata is surrounding layer of granulosa cell around the oocyte. Cumulus oophorus is kind of like a stalk which is holding these oocyte in position, and there is also multi-layer granulosa cells present. So the oocyte is fully mature at this point. It is known as Graafian follicle, I mean, due to the name of Reiner de Graaf, which was a Dutch physician. Anyway, this is the overall event of the ovarian cycle. But now let's try to understand the hormonal regulation. So here we are looking at the ovary. Key players are hypothalamus, so pituitary derived hormones such as FSH and LH. FSH, LH surge at around 14 days in the ovarian cycle. So when there is a surge, it leads to ovulation. After that, the corpus luteum derived progesterone level goes up. So progesterone level goes up in the luteal phase, whereas the estrogen level also spikes near the follicular phase. So what really happens? So basically, here is hypothalamus, which secretes GnRH or gonadotropin releasing hormone, which triggers FSH and LH secretion, and that triggers or positively triggers follicular development into different types of follicle. Now, these theca cells and granulosa cells are really important. The theca cells has receptor for LH. Granulosa cells has receptor for FSH. Remember, these are the hormones coming from pituitary, and now they act on these cell types in the ovary. Now, theca cells also secrete something called androstenedione, a precursor of the gonadal steroids. Now, aromatase enzyme convert androstenedione to estrone, which is basically going to give rise to estrogen. But initially, estrogen levels are low. This would give rise to a negative feedback. So overall, at the beginning phase, the FSH and LH levels are low. When the follicle matures gradually, there is huge amount of estrogen which is produced, and that starts the entire loop. So what really happens when the Graafian follicle is now matured? In this case, estrogen level also goes high. When estrogen level is high, it gives a positive stimulation to the pituitary. So basically the pituitary hypothalamus axis now gets positively regulated. So GnRH triggers more and more FSH and LH secretion. So since estrogen was increased, it triggers eventual increase in the level of FSH and LH, and that causes the LH surge. Now we can explain why LH surge happens and what is the role of these follicular theca and granulosa cells, what is the role of estrogen in that. So I can explain all of that in this video, I hope. So this triggers the LH surge, which is the prerequisite for ovulation. So overall, in the summary, we looked at what was ovulation and how the hormonal triggers control it. Get notes and flashcard in our Facebook page or Instagram page. See you in next video.